Well, howdy, 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 everybody in the Committed 100. Welcome back to Church History with me, Chris Stewart. Glad. Hey, Dave, how you doing? Glad you could be with us. As hopefully you got your pens, your paper, your highlighters ready, your drink of choice. I got some coffee here and some Diet Mountain Dew as we prepare to dive into the Crusades. Very dark but challenging time for the church and for the people of God. Hopefully, you were able to already join us for systematic theology this morning as we looked at what conversion is and some of its characteristics. Daylight, talking about what God's doing and preparing for Dr. Howard's move to Bama, as well as celebrating X's birthday and a little bit of discussion about true and false converts and conversion. And now, today, in church history, talking about the Crusades. With that, I'm going to switch over and where you guys can see the slides and not so much of this ugly mug. With that, let's dive right in. Church history. Hopefully, yeah, it should be able to still hear me. As we dive into the Crusades, and specifically during the Crusades, is this shift theologically, what we would call medieval doctrines. Once again, more of a foundation that had already been laid, starting in the 400s, is this adoration of Mary, some of the beginnings of purgatory, and the sacrifice of the Mass, the propitiatory sacrifice of the Mass, all starting in the 400s, but now coming to a head and being official church doctrine here in this medieval period. Today we're just going to be covering the Crusades and some of the theology behind the Crusades, and then next week diving into the what we would call the Catholic Church Councils and their rubber stamping, as it were, of a lot of the Marian dogmas, a lot of the dogmas surrounding communion, the propitiatory sacrifice of the Mass, and many of these other doctrines that had already been initiated in the 4th and 5th centuries, but now being official dogma of the church in roundabout, we're going to be looking from about 1090s to the mid 1300s this morning. So I want to take a look at Innocent III, became Pope in 1198 at 37 years old. He is pushing forward of papal power. Came to a head when he said the papacy is to the sun and the civil authorities is as to the moon. His thought was that the papacy held all of the powers both religiously and governmentally, so that within the Pope was the powers of the governments of the world, as well as the quote unquote keys of Peter and the power of Christ on earth, that he becomes the vicar of Christ or a substitute Christ. Also, in the just previous centuries to this, in about the 800s, starting in the ordination of priests, that they become alter Christus, alternate Christs, another Christ. The Pope clearly being the chief of these alter Christu, these other Christs, and now they're inserting their wealth, their political power, especially as we saw the church split in 1045, and how the Pope reined in governmental leaders with their ability to cut off those that gave taxes to kingdoms and their fealty or their allegiance to either the church or to the king. Also at this time, Innocent III starts what becomes known as Interdicts, or much like papal bulls of the Pope. An interdict is an ecclesiastical censure or a ban that prohibits persons, certain active church individuals, or groups from participating in certain rites, and that the rites and services of the church are banished from having validity in certain territories for a limited or extended amount of time. We saw this recently. Just in the last 2 years, the Roman Catholic Church has chosen, specifically the bishop over a particular church, has chosen not to offer Joe Biden, quote unquote, Holy Communion because of his stance on abortion. This would be considered an interdict by the bishop to prevent Joe Biden from taking of communion, that rite, which helps, quote unquote, according to their theology, for him to remain saved, by removing that option from him. This interdict becomes a useful tool for the Pope and for bishops and clerics in the Roman Catholic Church from this point on, from the medieval period on, in which they could wield this power of salvation or non-salvation in and through withholding communion, withholding baptism, specifically of infants, holding back of last rites, holding back of hello, is it working? All right, I think we're back. Had a technical glitch there for a second. Of holding back of those wanting to have their sins absolved by the priest. All of these things could be prevented from individuals or groups through these interdicts. Boniface VIII, 1234 to 1303, struggled with England and France during their ensuing war and the taxation of the clergy to pay for it. So this leader, Boniface VIII, was trying to create revenue to finance this war between England and France. And so they said the only way that they could really afford to do it is that they started taxing the clergy to pay for it, which in turn was a tax on the church. During this time, the struggles between Boniface VIII, Innocent III, and others is all while at the same time Islam comes to rise. We've talked about Islam in 2 previous sessions, in which now they're beginning to head both north and west in their conquering of lands. In lands previously, quote unquote, Christian, such as Spain, Portugal, Turkey, are now becoming Muslim strongholds. And at the time the Pope and the rulers of these kingdoms are fighting amongst each other, the Western horde of Islam comes charging through Europe. Islam begins to capture Western lands and to capture Palestine, Israel, and the Holy Land, and to raid and prevent pilgrims from worshiping in Jerusalem. Now, there are many different reasons why the Crusades began. The first of which is presented here, is that the church ran many of the, shall we say, tourist traps on the way to and from Israel, from what was called Palestine. The church made considerable money off of those tourist traps. Different stops along the route in which they would say that the wise men came from, or they would say that you're on the same road that Paul went to go on this journey. That all of these different stops and sightseeing stations were great revenue for the church. When Islam comes along and captures Palestine, the church is cut off from that revenue source. They're cut off from sending pilgrims or individuals to Jerusalem to do either training there at some of the churches or to just get the revenue in. With the European famine now starting, especially in the early 1100s, there's an east-west trade routes were being raided and cut off by Islam. So you have the religious, quote-unquote, issues of not being able to go to, quote-unquote, holy sites. Now also you have the revenue being cut off from those sites and those, well-wishers that want to come by. And now your trade routes are being cut off by Islam and being raided by some of the lesser clans and families in Islam. The church at the time, specifically the Pope, and kings were forced to act, but they needed to add a little incentive to do so. They couldn't really just order their troops to go fight, specifically to reclaim Palestine or to get these trade routes back working. So, in collaboration with each other, both the kings and the Pope, they resurfaced a doctrine that had, up until this time, almost died off. We start to see then these preachers called Peter the Hermit and Walter the Penniless coming up and proclaiming that we need to retake Jerusalem for the Lord and to usher in his kingdom there. That we need to reclaim the Holy Land, or to reclaim the land once under the dominion of the Holy Roman Emperor. Pope Urban II started with the very first crusade. He started to cut red cloths up into strips which he had sewn together in the forms of crosses. And they started calling it the Holy Cross. Many pictures and paintings that you see of crusaders being characterized by having a cross on their chest or their shield, from which we get the word crusade from. That this was supposedly a religious crusade. Well, it was more than just a religious crusade. Oddly enough, even Muslims up until recent times agreed that the Crusades were predominantly militaristic and political maneuver, not a religious one. It has only really been in this last century that Islam has considered the Crusades a religious persecution of Islam, or a religious war. It's amazing that we've gone over 1,000 years and that the Crusades were just considered a normal war between two states or two persons, and now they consider it religious. On top of this religious fervor that was brought up to raise funds as well as bring in people for the Crusades. The Crusades were actually initially started by many of the, shall we say, royalty in lands such as England, France, and Spain, in which many of the kings and princes and other royal family members would take up the banner of this going to redeem the Holy Land, and they would put much of their wealth and power into raising up armies for themselves to take down and to help conquer. Also at the same time, the Pope then resurfaces a doctrine such as purgatory. If you go with the crusade, you can get a plenary indulgence. Hey, Michael. Guten Tag. You can get a plenary indulgence. You just go to war, and if you can come back, all your sins will be forgiven because you're on this holy crusade. So the first crusade happens between 1095 and 1099 to try and retake Jerusalem. But there are many subsequent crusades. The tides of battle move back and forth, and lands that were conquered in 1095 then become conquered again by Islam, and it goes back and forth for almost 300 years. From 1095 to 1272, so 200 plus years. For 200 years, it's sending crusades and people and men and money to battle that may or may not come back. Pope Urban II, who helped to lead this first one, said this in a grand speech that is recorded several places. He says, all who die by the way, whether by land or by sea, or by battle against the pagans, Islam, shall have immediate remission of sins. This I grant them through the power of God, which I am invested. We see that the use of the position as Pope, the quote-unquote keeper of the keys of Peter, to grant these in what became known as indulgences to the Crusaders, those that wore the cross. So much so that Pope Urban said that it's as long as you do these things and you're wearing the cross, you will be absolved of your sins. Whether on your way there, by land or by sea, or whether you're in battle, as long as you die with the cross on, as long as you die in this crusade, you have immediate remission of sins. Oh, wait a second. Time out there, Chris. You got to be asking yourself theologically, what's the theological framework for this? Well, the theological framework is in reality, while the church at the time gave lip service to the cross, lip service to when Jesus said, "It is finished," to telestai, practically, that's not the way their theology went. That the cross only made a way to be saved, but one had to keep themselves saved. You had to be baptized as an infant. You had to continually take of communion and attend Mass whenever possible. You had to attend confession and have your venial and mortal sins forgiven by a priest after some type of penance. You could receive these indulgences to help wipe away these sins so that you didn't have to spend time in purgatory, working off your satisfatio, your atonement for your sins, so that you could then present yourself righteous before God. All of these doctrines that start in the 400s, that culminate here in the medieval period, are a direct offense to the completed work of Christ on the cross. They all add to the work of Christ. We also start seeing by the 900s what is called the treasure chest of the merits of the saints, of Mary and the saints. That somehow you can actually have extra merit. You can do good above and beyond your salvation to be put into this treasure, in which the Pope and others can then dole out this extra merit to absolve your sins to other people throughout history. What became known as supererogation. I know the spelling on that one's art. It's not out here in the fields where they irrigate their fields with water. No, it's not irrigation. Erogation. Supererogation. Merit. Works of supererogation are those performed beyond what God requires. So first off is a deficient view of sin and a deficient view of the corruption of mankind. Obviously, mankind is not as bad as they think. That salvation then puts them into a prime position to add to these merits, these works that then accumulate in an account. Indulgences in the works of supererogation performed by all the saints form a treasure with God, the treasury of merit, which the church can apply to exempt repentant sinners from the works of penance that would otherwise be required of them to achieve full remissions of the temporal punishment due to their sin. Supererogation is placed into the forefront of Catholic theology during the medieval period, because it was the prime means by which they could recruit soldiers for the war and funds for the war. As we go back to this theological underpinnings of the medieval doctrines, that they say that Jesus only needed to shed one drop, which is true. Only one drop was enough. That his blood was perfect. He was the sacrificial lamb slain from the foundation of the earth. The spotless lamb come to take away the sins of the world. They say that any other blood then that was spilled by Christ added to this treasure trove of merit. They also state that because Mary was quote unquote sinless from conception, that all of her good works while she was alive, including bearing Christ, adds to this extra merit. And that the saints, those that have been canonized as saints, have excess merit. All of this excess merit is added together. Where does this extra merit go? It's called the Thesaurus Meritorum, the treasury of merit. And who controls this treasury? The Pope and the Church. Certain individuals in the church, certain bishops and priests, can be given extra special powers by the Pope at certain times. In fact, just a couple of years ago, there was a Jubilee year declared by the Pope in which he gave specific priests and cathedrals the rights to give indulgences. If you walked up a set of stairs, for instance, you could receive a special indulgence, or if you walked through certain doors that weren't normally open the rest of the year, you could receive an indulgence. Through this treasury of merit, we get these indulgences that are even till this day. What I often like to call them is a checkbook of merit, that a bishop or a priest can sign a piece of paper, an indulgence by proxy, in which a person is absolved of their sin and certain amount of excess merit is taken from the Thesaurus Meritorum and placed upon this individual. One of my big questions is who knows how much is in the Thesaurus Meritorum? Who keeps track of when somebody makes a deposit? Or when one of these priests is giving an indulgence? Not only that, it makes the cross a mockery. It makes Jesus a liar when he says, "It is finished." It adds our works with the completed work of Christ on the cross and calls Jesus a liar. In Roman Catholic theology that is placed, as we will see, especially in the upcoming councils, that Jesus gives a type of justification that can be lost. Can give you a standing with God that can be lost, in which they would say if you do a venial sin, a lesser sin, that you keep your justification and that you just need penance. If you commit a mortal sin, one of the big 12, that you lose your justification, you're just as evil and unrighteous as the next heathen at that point, and that you need to re-earn justification by doing of penance and the sacraments. Sacraments being communion, being offerings, being baptism, being the 7 sacraments of the church. So somehow, somewhere, according to the theology, somebody has to add up your penance and your sacraments that you've done, divide those by your sins, and that somehow equals your amount of time you would spend in purgatory. So the more penance and sacraments and going to church you do, the more that is going to offset this giant balancing beam or this giant scales of your good works versus your bad works. And the difference is then attributed to you in time in purgatory, in time in suffering, in which you personally suffer the penalty for your sin. Once again, it's called the satisfatio, the personal suffering. This is penitential. In other words, this is a judicial suffering for your sins in purgatory. This isn't Satan giving you this punishment, that this is God giving you this punishment so that you can work off your sins. It makes a mockery of those that God has called righteous, then in saying that God would punish them in purgatory for their sins. It does not follow. When Jesus says, it is finished, he didn't say to the other thief on the cross, today you will be with me in purgatory so that you can work off your sins. No, he said, today you'll be with me in paradise. When we read the story of Lazarus and the rich man, it doesn't say that the rich man could ever go, in Luke 14, could ever go from Hades, do you go from the place of the dead and go to Abraham's bosom or even go to heaven? That he was there permanently. That he wasn't undergoing satisfatio, suffering for his sins, in order to get out of heaven. If that is true, then ultimately, as many modern Roman Catholics put it, then no one eventually will be in hell. That eventually hell would be loosed of all of its inhabitants because they all would have undergone enough time in satisfatio for their sins. Also, just previous to this time, was a theology called the Sabbatine Privilege, that if you wore the scapular, a specific pendant, and you died, that Mary would come down on the second Saturday after you died into purgatory and to carry you out of purgatory and bring you into heaven. That if you had purchased this scapular, this pendant, and done all of your penance and sacraments and that you would only have to spend 2 weeks in purgatory. My big question is number one, how does time work in an eternal place? If in fact purgatory is real, which I do not believe it is, what is time in purgatory? What is time to God in an eternal state? How can they say that Mary will come down and to save you? Once again, the emphasis on Mary being a co-redemptrix within Catholic theology coming high on the list during the medieval period. What are some of the results of these crusades? We see that many thousands upon thousands died during these crusades. Many different entire families being wiped out due to the wars. We see the rise of towns rather than fiefdoms. We see the utter destruction of feudalism because many of the rich young rulers went off to war and died. You see a destruction of those different class distinctions between serfs or servants and lords. You see a rise of what we would call the middle class. Those that aren't servants, those that serve themselves and are able to make a moderate amount of income through their business in order to sustain themselves. You see a change from the Holy Roman Empire to the creation of monarchies, of kings such as over England and France. You see a rise in romantic literature. International trade and commerce after the Crusades increases. There's less robbers and raiders on the trade routes. But you also see an increase in heretical teaching. That as the trade routes open, many of these being the Roman roads in which helped begin the spread of Christianity, then are used to bring false teaching into the world. Increase in banking and shipping. Now that there's a middle class, there's a need to have a place in which for them to put their funds, and also for things to come in for that middle class to buy. You see an increased hostility between Islam and Christianity, many skirmishes post the Crusades, and the increase in power of Islam in places such as Turkey and Spain and Portugal. Increased power of the papacy. Now, we have to remember, since feudalism is dying, that monarchies are coming up, and those that were lords, many of which had passed away, that power vacuum. Hey, Aaron and Brenda, glad you guys could join that power vacuum left from those that had died was sucked up either by the monarchies or by the papacy. We start to see more and more different monies or currency being created, each nation starting their own form of currency. And we also see a lot of power transfer to Israel. We see a lot of kings vying over who's the Templar or who is the king over Israel, and many wars in between themselves. We see a class of knights rise up to become the protector of churches up until Black Friday, of course. But you see them protecting the churches so that the need for the crusade wouldn't happen again, that they wouldn't come under Islam control. You see more action, more interaction between nations as the Crusades required the nations underneath the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope to work together in order to achieve the capture of Israel. You see the wealth of the Roman Catholic Church expand exponentially. Many of those that went to war found great wealth along the way as they raided towns and villages, and eventually even the Holy Land itself. Great wealth was absorbed into the church. And you see the mass slaughter of men, women, and children, especially of the Turks, not the Turkish, but of the Turks, those in which mainly they fought against Turkey being part of this coalition of different, it would probably, we would call it properly the first real caliphate of Islam, in which rose together to fight against the Crusaders. But during that time, all of these doctrines are being created in the midst of these 7 wars. In the midst of these 7 wars, the world drastically changed. The church changed theologically. The people changed their devotion, in my opinion, from Jesus to Mary. We see the great rise in the power and the position of the Pope. And you see a great rally around a cultural kind of Christianity, especially around the Third Crusade, what we call the King's Crusade. King Richard the Lion-Hearted leading this one from England, and also the king from France, leading the way in this crusade, in which propped up this doctrine of purgatory, in which during these crusades many evils were committed. Not the rape and the pillage and the murder of entire almost nations, as it would take months and months for an army from England to travel across through France and down to Israel. That as these 7 crusades go on, a large portion of the fighting age males dies off, in which the prosperity and the population is immediately slashed, in which then, by the time we reach the end of the 7th Crusade, in which we start seeing plagues and disease rack entire nations that are already dealing with the effects that have come from the crusade and from these doctrines and their faith, and utterly sometimes wipe out entire villages, entire cities. All around, not just a religious war, but a war against nation, in which was propped up on false terms, on false ideas, on false ideologies, that led to, I think, the largest division between Christianity and Islam is because of the Crusades. that I think if it had not been a quote unquote holy war, or as the Muslims would put it, a jihad, that the relationship and the potential reaching of those that hold to Islam towards Christianity would have been quite different if history had not have played out like it is. Starting the next several weeks, we're going to start looking at all of the different, in fact, let me pop down to that list for you. Future councils that we're going to look at, the four Lateran councils and the different councils that then occur, especially culminating in the Council of Trent during the Reformation period. We're slowly but surely leading up to the Reformation period. We're slowly but surely leading up to Luther and the beginning of what we would call the Reformation, and Calvin and Zwingli and the Anabaptists. But before we get there, we have to realize how far away the church is going away from biblical doctrine, as we've seen with purgatory and indulgences, that the institution of these things, starting in the 400s, really coming to popularity in the 900s, and then being used for the Crusades here in, between 1095 and 1275, then influencing the rest of the church post the Crusades. That by the time we see preachers of indulgences saying that as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs, that this type of theology became commonplace, in which there was preachers of the church throughout there selling these indulgences, once again, to raise funds for the church. In the time of the Reformation, it was to raise funds for St. Peter's Basilica. But we see that it being a money-raising tool and not a theological tool. We're going to look at these councils that will raise up the veneration, or as I call it, the worship of Mary. And we'll discuss the difference between dulia and hyperdulia, worship, veneration versus worship, in which we're also going to see Mary placed as never dying, and Mary placed as never having original sin, Mary being co-redemptrix, co-mediator between God and man. All of that stuff is going to show up in these councils, in which we can clearly see the church taking a left turn at Albuquerque, so to speak, and to bringing to life the errors of the previous generations. Just as once we get into the modern period, once we fast forward then 300 years past the Reformation, then we're going to see the errors that have been continued from a singular man and his false ideas that became popular, that filtered into modern Baptist theology. Sad to see that mankind is consistent in this, that they don't want to study history, don't want to look at the lessons that are taught, and that we then, because of that, repeat the errors time after time after time. Time after time. Okay, sorry. Wrong song. With that, I'm glad you guys could join me today as we looked at church history and the Crusade period, a very dark period of time, not just because it was in the Dark Ages, but a dark period of time, both for the church and for the people of God and for the nations around the world. In the same way, as we continue to look at these councils, continue to see the development of doctrine and see where it went wrong, see where the church is repeating some of these patterns, especially once we come to Vatican II in 1950, and now with Pope Frankie and what he's been doing these last several years. With that, I pray that God would bless you, that he keep you, may make his face shine upon you and give you rest this week. And stay tuned in the Committed 100 now that we're 100 plus members, and see what God is doing in our midst. With that, see you guys later.